Stolen Charms by Rebecca, Aileen, Alex, and Natalie. Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, a queen had passed away while giving birth to a beautiful daughter named Snow White. A year later, the king remarried a gorgeous woman who was proud, arrogant, and couldn't stand anyone who could surpass her in beauty. She had a marvelous mirror, and while standing and admiring herself, she would say,
"Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?"
and the mirror would reply,
"Lady, you are the fairest one of all."
As Snow White turns 17, she grows more and more beautiful, causing the queen to become more envious. This makes her ask the mirror more frequently who the fairest one of all is. As time went on, the mirror's reply would change to,
"Lady, you are the fairest here, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer."
One day, the king embarked on a hunt for the kingdom's food with his mightiest knights, but when they returned to the palace, the heartbreaking news that the king had died was announced. This allowed the queen to become the sole ruler and parent of Snow White, which caused the young princess to feel like she had no one left, leaving her with a great amount of depression and anxiety. To cope with her newfound mental illness, she started stealing small things from the village, like spoons, bread, or small buttons. Even from her stepmother, she was taking little trinkets. Although she knew it wasn't right, she hid her disorder since it was the only way she found comfort from her trauma. Because Snow White was so fair, the people in the village assumed that the queen was just trying to frame the innocent princess, so that they would not turn against her. Thus, the queen banished Snow White for her acts of theft and secrecy, assuming the wild animals would soon devour her, which would solve both the villagers' and the queen's problems. Now that the poor child was left alone to run through the never-ending forest, stressed by the wild animals that would leap past her, she began to steal from cottage to cottage. She then saw a little vacant house in the middle of nowhere and decided it would be the perfect place to rest for the night. When it had grown quite dark, the 7 dwarfs who dug and mined for gems in the mountains returned home to see that food was eaten and all the beds seemed laden. Fetching their lanterns, while inspecting their home, they find that the intruder was a fair young lady. When morning came, Snow White awoke to see the 7 dwarfs watching her, questionably asking,
"What's your name? How did you come to be in our house?"
"My name is Snow White."
She replied. She lied about how her stepmother had banished her out of jealousy and had run all day until, at last, she had found their little home. So the dwarfs allowed Snow White to stay with them as long as she repaid the favor by cleaning and cooking for them. As a thank you, she gifted them some of her stolen items, each day before they went out into the mountains in search of gems and gold. The dwarfs would warn her,
"Beware your stepmother. She'll soon find out that you're here. Don't let anyone in."
Throughout the day, the girl was on her own, so as she was cleaning, although it had no value to her, she took the laces from their boots, buttons from their pajamas, and small miscellaneous items for relief. As for the queen, when she believed the animals by now had eaten Snow White, she had no other thought but that finally she was the fairest of them all. So she stood before her mirror and said,
"Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?"
The mirror answered,
"Lady, you are the fairest here, but Snow White, living far away with the 7 dwarfs, is still 1,000 times more fair."
The queen was horrified, for she knew that the mirror did not lie, and realized Snow White was still alive. So she stained her face, dressed up like an old hunchback woman, and with the black arts she made poisoned apples. In this disguise she crossed the forest. When she arrived at the cottage, in an attempt to get the young lady's attention, she put down the basket of the shiniest apples by a tree and left them there as bait. Poor Snow White expected nothing and couldn't resist the urge to take a few apples before the old woman returned. Taking a big bite of the apple, as red as her lips, the poison took effect and immediately caused her to fall unconscious. When the dwarfs returned home, they found Snow White lying on the ground unconscious and without a heartbeat. They knew she was dead. Thinking about what great beauty she had, they decided not to bury her and instead made a transparent coffin out of glass so that she could be admired with all her belongings, not knowing that they were actually stolen. Placed in the coffin out on the mountainside, the young princess lay sound asleep, and one of the dwarfs always stood guard to watch over it. She looked as if she were asleep, for her skin was still white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. One day, a young prince stumbled upon the dwarf's house and saw the stunning Snow White in her glass coffin. Intrigued by her beauty, he pleaded with the dwarfs to give him the coffin, offering them riches in return. When they refused, he begged by confessing his deep admiration for Snow White. Touched by his words, the dwarfs granted his wish, assisting him in loading the coffin onto his carriage. As the prince and his men passed through the princess's village, the villagers saw their missing belongings amongst her possessions and they erupted into chaos. The uproar caused the carriage to overturn, dislodging the bite of the poisoned apple lodged in Snow White's throat. With a gasp, she opened her eyes, pushed the coffin lid aside, sat up, and returned to the realm of the living once more. With support from the prince, she faced her fear of getting caught, and she apologized to the villagers and promised to find treatment to help with compulsive stealing. Snow White was able to overcome her kleptomania by going to cognitive behavioral therapy, and they lived happily ever after. The end.